Okay, it's an enormous pleasure to introduce you to Professor Geoffrey Leech, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Linguistics and English Language here at Lancaster University, and a long-standing corpus linguist. When did you first encounter corpora, Jeff?
It was way back in the 60s, actually. At that time I was in University College London.
Okay,
and,
so Bloomsbury.
Bloomsbury,
Yeah.
actually. And that is where corpora, can I use that word corpora?
Yeah, it's the plural for corpus.
Okay. Okay. That was in the, by the way, I'm not in favour of corpora, it's just this caught
I know,
on.
it's caught on, it's a sort of snot-plural that's caught on and we can't escape from it now.
I'm afraid so, yeah. So anyway, in those days, no corpus existed in the modern sense at all, but my senior colleague, I can't call him my supervisor because he wasn't, was Randolph Quirk.
Okay.
Yes,
Natalie Lord Quirk.
now he's Lord Quirk, that's right. And he's still going strong at the age of 93, I think it is.
Good.
Anyway, in those days, of course, he was a youngish, bright and bushy-tailed professor of about 50, I think. And so one of his great projects that he started at UCL was to build a corpus of modern English.
Where did he get the idea from?
I don't really know. It was in the air because if you go back a few years before 1960s, that was the era of American structuralism.
Right.
American linguists were very keen on building up linguistic description from the base, as it were, from the empirical base. Get your data, and then you can work out your grammar.
Right.
Which is the opposite of what happened later with Chomsky, where you start with the grand abstractions and then you work down to the data. So this bottom-up philosophy, which was very fashionable in the 1940s and 50s, of course meant that any language you were going to study really had to build a corpus of it.
Right.
And for the American structuralists, that was often a matter of going out into the field to the Native American tribes and collecting data from them, writing it all down and then transcribing it. But so nobody, I think, before that time, before Quirk, had really thought of making a fairly representative corpus of the present-day English language.
Yes. And did he put it on a computer immediately, or was that a later innovation? Because a lot of the American structuralist work was sort of field notes, as I think of them.
That's right.
Paper-based.
That's exactly. And so Randolph Quirk was in that sort of pre-computer age, really. And I suppose in 1960, when he began, there were rather primitive corpora around, but they were more or less, primitive computers around, but they were more or less restricted to the
cognoscenti,
and the scientists and mathematicians and so on. Basically they were number crunching machines in the way people regarded them in those days. So getting them to work with language was not an easy task. However, to start with, Randolph Quirk, he was very advanced in his technology with recording speech. So he had a lot of recorded impromptu discussions and spoken conversations and so on.
Was it reel-to-reel tape or something like that?
Yes, it was, on reel-to-reel tape. And then, of course, he had some researchers who worked with him, people like Jan Svartvik and Sidney Greenbaum, who were busy listening in and transcribing this spoken language. So in that way, he wasn't any kind of technophobe. But it was all this data was collected and transcribed and put into enormous metal cabinets, which were really like that because they had to be fireproof.
Right. You didn't want to burn your only paper copy.
Exactly. I mean, your corpus was there in the room.
Yes.
In big metal cabinets. And so it wasn't until the 70s really that corpus at UCL was computerized.
Right. And that was a case of typing it up again, essentially, typing it into a computer or something.
I suppose it was, yes. That was Jan Svartvik who did most of that stuff. But anyway, yes, of course, a lot of the data was written, and so we started to use that corpus in the late 60s. when we wrote our first sort of major grammar of English, work at al. #1, that's to say the grammar of contemporary English. So at that stage already we could say corpus-based grammar was getting off the ground. Yes.
And it was something, well, I think of that period of the survey in London as something of a sort of stellar nursery of linguists. Because quite a lot of important linguists actually worked there. There was you, Jan Svartvik, Sidney Greenbaum, I think David Crystal.
Yes, David Crystal was also in the survey at that stage.
I think Norman Fairclough.
Norman Fairclough, yes.
Not that a lot of people would associate Norman with that type of work nowadays, but he did start off that.
Well, he was a student, and he was one of my earliest students, actually. And it's through Norman that I eventually moved from London to Lancaster.
Great. Oh, well, tell us that story. How did you get to be here?
Well, Norman Fairclough was a senior student, I think I'd call him, still working on his BA when I was there. And he was, and you know, when he graduated, he got a job in this new, brand new almost, university in the far distant north of England called Lancaster.
Yes.
And many of us hadn't heard of it, or if we'd heard of it, we got confused with Manchester.
Oh.
That was the general feeling down south. But anyway, Norman, in a pioneering spirit, started working in the English department here at Lancaster, which was then obviously very new and which hadn't really got much of a track record at all in research. And so when I came out at, partly I think it was through Norman informing me of the job, you know, probably if he hadn't...
Dear Jeff, have you seen this time?
Yeah. So I came up here, and so we sat around a table, about 5 of us who were specialising in modern English, and thought, what should we do? In Lancaster, there's a new university, can we do anything to put it on the map? And so the suggestion I made at that stage was, why not imitate this new-fangled Brown corpus?
Right, which is the 1 million words from Brown University.
That's exactly so. American English.
Or computerised.
Exactly, yes. And that was the first computerised corpus of English, actually. So we got a copy of that corpus. We were in touch with the main compiler of that corpus.
Henry Francis?
Nelson Francis.
Nelson Francis and Henry Couture got the
That's right, yeah. So we thought we'd take it up, and Norman was very keen, and I was keen, and we didn't really realise what a dreadful time we were going to have over the next 10 years.
Big task.
Yes. And the biggest task was actually the copyright problem. We had to try and negotiate copyright with the British publishers for about 500 texts, and eventually I sort of gave up the ghost. I said, I can't do this anymore. We've run out of money. We've got rather primitive computing resources. We can't get permission from the publishers or the agents or the authors. Let's give it up. But at that stage, kind of angel from on high appeared in the form of Stig Johansson.
From Oslo.
Yeah, he was actually originally he was a student of Jan Svartvik in Lund in Sweden, so he was already baptized into the corpus fraternity. And he happened to come to Lancaster on a Fulbright fellowship or something for a year. And look at that, he got the corpus bug. Fortunately for us, he went back to Scandinavia and decided that he would take the Lancaster corpus, as it was then, to make this 1 million word corpus, which would be a matching corpus for the Brown corpus of America, so that we would then have two comparable corpora that we could
compare and contrast.
Compare and contrast, yes. And Nelson Francis himself was actually instrumental in making us work towards that goal, because when I said to him, we're thinking of doing a corpus, I sent him a letter, no emails or anything in those days. I sent him a letter saying, well, we're thinking of building a corpus like your Brown corpus of British English, and do you have any recommendations or thoughts about it? And so he said, well, for heaven's sake, make it as close as possible a match for what we've done for American English. And of course that was a very sensible piece of advice, because it did make it possible, the whole story that I was talking about in my last interview about comparison of corpora across different regions and different generations.
Yeah, well, that's marvellous. So that gives us the L and the O of Lob, because we have Lancaster and Oslo.
Yes.
And the B is for Bergen.
Bergen, that's right. Of course, that's another Norwegian university. And when Stig Johansen got back to Norway, he was looking for somebody to collaborate with him. Got some quite generous grant from the Norwegian Scientific Foundation. But he needed somebody with a computer expertise, and so he found it in someone called Knut Hofland in Bergen University. They had a kind of research centre there on language, and so he was able to tap into that and make a good collaboration between the two Norwegian universities, which has really made a big difference to the way corpora have developed, I think.
So Norwegian funding helped that. Did you get any funding at the British end when you started?
Yes, a little bit, but it wasn't enough as it turned out. I mean, this is one of the reasons I decided I wanted to give up in about 1976. The reason to begin with, we got a nice little grant from the publishers, Longman,
right?
Yes, because they had been in close liaison with Randolph Quirk in London, and I'd had books published by them and so on. And so they were quite interested in the work. I think the amount of money was £3,200.
A princely sum in those days.
Sounds really like peanuts today. It was important too.
Absolutely.
Anyway, we soon used up that money, and really we just kept going from hand to mouth. But again, because of the help Steve got in Norway, we were able to complete the corpus. And from then, things went up, because we then got more money from British sources. I think it was the Social Science Research Council and bodies like that. We got some money to do the annotation of the corpus.
Right, because that was the next major step, really, moving on to doing grammatical annotation of the corpus, part of speech annotation.
That's right, yes.
Could you tell us the story of that? Because it's interesting in that that entailed the development of one of the earliest and still most accurate parts of speech taggers.
That's right.
Clause.
That's right. The Lancaster tagger clause really began shortly after we completed the Lob corpus. That was the one that we were doing. We had finished with the Norwegians. And we thought, well, what's the next stage? Obviously, we want to do some sort of grammatical analysis of this data. And once again, fortunately, we had our model in what they'd been doing at Brown University.
Right.
So some people in Brown under Nelson Francis and Henry Kuchra had developed a very primitive grammatical tagger. I mean, it was just an MA project.
It's like Green and Rubin. Yeah.
Yes, you remember that. Yeah. Green and Rubin.
I think it was.
They invented this new device called Taggart, and it's unbelievable now to think back to how things have developed since then. And so they've managed to do a tagging of their Brown corpus. Each word, in other words, having a grammatical label saying it's a noun or an adjective or what kind of pronoun it is, etc. Yes, and I think it was at a conference in Norway. By the way, I should tell you, we had set up this organisation called ICANN,
oh, yes.
International Corpus
archive of...
Oh, sorry, the International Computer Archive of Modern English. Okay, that's what it was then. Changed its name slightly since.
Yeah.
So that was the first organisation of any kind for corpus research, corpus development. And so we had either the very first conference or possibly the second conference that we met there, and Nelson Francis and Henry Kuchera came over from Brown University in the States. And they brought this wonderful mag tape. You know, corpora in those days were stored on these enormous heavy metal tapes, mag tapes. And very, very kindly and fortunately, they lent us this corpus, which had all the tags on it. And so we were then able to develop this method of using the corpus as a training corpus.
Yes.
I think nowadays, probably later, we call it a training corpus. In other words, it gave us all the statistical data we needed to develop our own tagger for British English.
Well, that's interesting you say statistical, because I remember picking up your book, The Computational Analysis of English, in about 1987 or 1988. And up to that point, I really looked at logics and things like that as ways of analysing language or writing programs to do. I remember reading that book and thinking, this is amazing. They're using statistics to do it, which nobody else seemed to be at the time. And I went back and read that book with enormous fascination, and thought it was a really strong idea and a great thing to do. And like a lot of the other NLP or natural language processing technology at the time, it actually worked.
Exactly.
Which there is actually working. So how did you come across the idea and decide to approach something like grammatical analysis by using numbers?
Well, it was a matter of kind of trial and error, I suppose. I mean, the tagger, the first tagger of all, that's Green and Ruler's Taggart, was about 70% successful, I think, and about 30% of the tags had to be disambiguated, to use the technical term, had to be resolved by hand. And then we had this little project, Roger Garside from computing, me from linguistics, and there are two research associates who we could afford to employ on that project. One of them was called Ian Marshall, and Ian Marshall was playing around with the data, and he said, well, look, I've just discovered that if we do it this way, using this probabilistic algorithm, sort of stochastic methodology, we can get a much higher success rate, way up in the 90s, somewhere 96%. So that was a great breakthrough from our point of view. And after, of course, that became almost a kind of recognised methodology.
For doing it in most languages.
But and there was also a kind of division between those who believed in the statistical methodology and those who believed in the rule-driven methodology. And eventually, I think people arrived at some sort of compromise. You know, for some things it's good to use rule-driven methods. For some purposes, it's good to use statistical methodology. The great trick is to somehow combine
two together.
Hybrid tagger. But ours is really a hybrid tagger in the original form.
It was, because there were rules, weren't there? We used to call it, I think, inaccurately in some ways, we used to call it the idiom list and things like that. But when you looked at it, it was actually rules.
Exactly,
And then through the 80s, you worked quite a lot with IBM, as I recall.
That's right, yes. When did you come on the scene?
Late 80s. We met up when I came up for a supervision with Jenny Thomas, and we started talking about this because I just read that book, and I was terrifically interested in finding out more about it.
So before that you were an undergraduate?
I was an undergraduate, yeah, but we didn't really get exposed to that much. We expose students to it now. But I remember there was a sort of a locked room in the department in which we knew things were going on, but we didn't quite know what. So it was really in the late 80s.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So
that was the IBM work.
You were working on the IBM data, weren't you? And I suppose that's the stage when we really reached our zenith of our research efforts, because by that time it hadn't become routine all over the world. We were still, in a way, we were still with our noses in front, as it were. We felt we were still doing something exciting and new. And I think after that, in the 90s, probably we got overtaken by the immense efforts that the Americans put into corpus-based sort of
tool development.
But anyway, we kept going. We're still ahead in some ways.
I think at that point, of course, we then switched to applications of and use of, and that's in many ways what this course is about. That we're focusing on the many uses of corpora. Because you're right, when the likes of New Mexico computing labs are interested in building taggers, they have the person power to do it. But yes, that was an interesting period in the 80s, where sort of technically, in the sense of tool development.
And I must just tell you about our relationship with IBM. Fred Jelinek, he was the great guru in this area of statistics.
I remember meeting him, he was quite terrifying.
He was quite terrifying.
He was a nice chap, but quite terrifying.
Yes. And he had this sort of broad Czech accent, where he'd been living in America for a generation. And he really thumbed his nose at the linguistic fraternity of those years, Chomsky, he wasn't at all interested, he thought they were idiots, really.
Yes.
He said, well, give me enough data and I can produce a much better machine translation algorithm than you can with as many rules as you like to build,
Of course, I think famously he said that every time he sacked a linguist from his team, the accuracy of his system improved.
I believe he did.
Whether we approve of that or believe it, we won't say.
And of course they were using it to develop speech recognition.
Absolutely. Harpy, I think, was his system from that, something like that.
And to begin with, they could only reproduce speech in the written form if you separated each word by a little gap and then went on to the next one. So it's a little bit of a slow process of dictating your letters to a computer.
Word by word.
It was the beginning of something very, very, very important, I think.
I remember going across to T.J. Watson to give a talk, and I met Fred Jelinek and some John Lafferty, people like that. And it was a very exciting moment to go over there and meet them, because they'd been doing such interesting work for such a long time.
Yes, that's right.
But it was probably one of the most challenging audiences I ever talked to, because they were very, very bright people. And then into the 90s, of course, there was another major corpus development with the British National Corpus.
That's right, yes. That began, I suppose, the very first beginnings of it were in the late 80s. I remember being on a conference, what was it called, a bar conference or something? It was in Greece, in a very lovely area of Greece, Chalkidiki. And for some reason, this chap, rather impressive looking chap from Oxford, who buttonholed me, his name was Simon Murisimbo, I remember that. And he was developing a proposal to build a British national corpus. This was in about 90. The project actually took off in 91, but there was obviously a lot of work developing the project, which was, again, it was a kind of special time where this was possible, because the British government, like many governments in those days, were trying to develop electronic wizardry in all kinds of directions, and particularly linguistic applications, for the first time using computers in linguistic applications like machine translation or speech recognition, this was really considered an important industrial development.
Automated content analysis.
Exactly, yeah. So all these things were getting underway, and the British government decided it could afford to put forward this programme which would involve collaboration between industry and university in this kind of research, and building a big national corpus, which is now, of course, referred to as the BNC. And it took about 4 years to finish the job. And it involved collaboration between Oxford University, Lancaster University, we were doing the annotation side, and also Longman, yes, Longman, the publishers, were responsible for the spoken part of the BNC. And of course, I should have mentioned originally OUP, Oxford University Press, were the lead collaborator on this project, lead investigator. Yes, and so somehow we managed to get this very large project off the ground, and all kinds of difficulties which I don't need to elaborate on, but eventually we finished it.
It was a major undertaking.
Yes, but of course, having been involved, I could still see the flaws and thought, well, if we only we'd had more time to do a proper job, etc. But still, it has, I think it's proved its worth over the years.
It's 10 million words of spontaneous speech, orthographically transcribed. It's still, I think the best resource for studying English as it is spoken to this day. That's good.
And people say, well, we need a new BNC, but somehow I don't think it'll ever happen. It would be too much money for somebody to give to that project.
We'll see. There may be some ingenious fellow or lady somewhere who'll think of a way of doing it. It'd be great if they did.
Well, I think, nowadays we have the great advantage of all that text out there on the web, and even in transcribed speech, and large corpora like Mark Davis's Corpus of contemporary language. They're all online there. So, it's not beyond the wit of the human race to dream up another BNC, perhaps.
Let's keep our fingers crossed. Well, on that hopeful note, shall we conclude? I've really enjoyed that conversation. It's been a wonderful walk down memory lane.
Right, thank you.
And thank you for the conversation, Jeff. Greatly appreciate it.
Good. Thank you also for turning out. It's great.